In this opportunity, we are going to talk about terminal value and exchange rates. As was explained in a previous video, when a weak currency projection is made, free cash flows must be converted into the equivalent hard currency free cash flows by using the corresponding exchange rate for each year. When the terminal value is the present value of a perpetuity, the conversion must also apply to the cash flows of the perpetuity. We know that by definition, perpetuities are forever. Thus, the exchange rate of the first cash flow of the perpetuity must be an equilibrium one, meaning that this exchange rate must be consistent with the differential inflation between the weak currency and the strong currency. A common error is to use the last exchange rate for the cash flow projection period as the one applying to the perpetuity. But the fact is that this exchange rate might not be in equilibrium. Let us illustrate with an example. First, let's define some terms here. We call weak currency WC, strong currency SC. Free cash flow is FCF, and XR is the exchange rate. And the exchange rate is in terms of weak currency divided by strong currency, units of strong currency per unit of strong currency. Let's assume that we start with an exchange rate of 10 units of weak currency per unit of a strong currency. And now let's imagine a very simple cash flow of 1,000 per year over 10 years. And this cash flow is expressed in weak currency in real terms. Now let's assume that we have certain inflation over these 10 years. 5% in year 1, 6% in year 2, 8% in year 3, etc. And this, of course, is estimated inflation in weak currency. This estimated inflation allows us to calculate a cumulative inflation factor. For year 1, the inflation factor will be 1.05. Year 2, 1.11, and this, of course, accounts for years 1 and year 2. Year 3, 120, and so on. Okay, once we have the cumulative inflation factor, we are ready to calculate the nominal free cash flow in weak currency. It is simply the product of the real free cash flow by the cumulative inflation factor. For instance, in year 1, the weak currency nominal free cash flow will be 1,050, which is just the product of 1,000 by 105, which is the cumulative inflation factor. Year 2, we multiply 1,000 by 1.11, and we obtain 1,113, and that will be the weak currency cash flow in nominal terms in year 2. And we do the same year by year until we reach the final year, year 10. In year 10, we have a weak currency real cash flow of 1,000, and we have a cumulative inflation factor over the whole 10 years of 2.64. Then the weak currency nominal free cash flow will be 2,642 with 47. Now let's focus on the exchange rate. We will assume that the exchange rate will not be adjusted in tandem with inflation. Some years the adjustment will be less than the corresponding inflation, some years will be more. And the reason why the exchange rate does not evolve with inflation as it should evolve is because of political reasons. Okay? And this is very common in emerging markets. For instance, in an election year, many emerging markets decide not to devalue the currency in order to make imported products cheaper, or to avoid this imported product products to increase too much in price. Whereas, for instance, after the election, there is usually a big adjustment in the exchange rate. And this is what we are showing here. We are assuming an adjustment of the exchange rate of 50% of inflation in year 1, 20% of inflation in year 2, 0% in the election year, which is year 3, 300% the year just after the election year, and so on. This allows us to calculate the exchange rate per each year. The exchange rate for year one will be 10.25, year 2 will be 10.37, 10.37 also in year 3, 13.48 in year 4, etc. Now we are ready to calculate the nominal free cash flows in a strong currency. They are simply the result of dividing the nominal free cash flow in weak currency by the corresponding exchange rate. For instance, in year 1, we have a nominal free cash flow in strong currency of 102 with 44, and this results from dividing 1050, the weak currency nominal free cash flow, by the exchange rate of that year, which is 10.25. So 1050 divided by 10.25 gives us 102 with 44. And we do the same every year until we reach the final year, year 10, in which we have a cumulative we have an exchange rate of 24.79, and we have a weak currency nominal free cash flow of 2,642 with 47. So the strong currency nominal free cash flow will be 2,642 with 47 divided by the exchange rate of year 10, which is 24.79. So the result is 106 with 60. But what would have happened if the exchange rate were in equilibrium, meaning that the final exchange rate at the end of the 10 years reflects exactly what is going on with inflation? We know that cumulative inflation in weak currency is 2.64 for the 10 years. So the cumulative inflation factor is 2.64. So given that the initial exchange rate was 10, then the equilibrium exchange rate for year 10 will be the initial exchange rate of 10 multiplied by the cumulative inflation factor of 2.64. So the equilibrium exchange rate for year 10 will be 26.42. So if we take the weak currency nominal free cash flow of 2,642 with 47 and divided by the equilibrium exchange rate in year 10 of 26.42, we obtain a year 10 free cash flow in a strong currency, nominal terms, of 100. So we see that there is some difference between this cash flow, equilibrium cash flow for the perpetuity, and the cash flow that we obtain using the inflation, using the non-inflation adjusted exchange rate. So there is a difference. 100 is the equilibrium one, and 106 with 60 is the one that is not in equilibrium. So summarizing, the equilibrium exchange rate for year 10 is now 26.42 instead of 24.79, which we obtained initially. 26.42 is the right exchange rate to convert the last cash flow in weak currency into its equivalent in hard currency regarding the perpetuity, because, as we said at the beginning, we need an equilibrium exchange rate for the perpetuity. In this example, we made two simplified assumptions that we didn't announce in an explicit way. First, that the exchange rate at T0 was in equilibrium. This 10 exchange rate of 10 at the beginning, that it was in equilibrium. Well, if this were not the case, the initial exchange rate must be adjusted to the equilibrium level at time 0 before multiplying that exchange rate by the cumulative inflation factor. And the other assumption was that the inflation in hard currency was 0 over the 10 years. Well, if this were not the case, the equilibrium exchange rate at the end of the projection, that we will call XRN, must be calculated with this formula down here. This formula accounts not only for cumulative inflation in weak currency, but also with cumulative inflation in a strong currency. So the formula is that the exchange rate, the equilibrium exchange rate in year n, in our example year 10, will be equal to the exchange rate at time 0, and this has to be an equilibrium exchange rate at time 0, multiplied by this factor. In the numerator we have 1 plus cumulative inflation in weak currency divided by 1 plus cumulative inflation in strong currency. Now let's modify our example by doing some changes to the initial exchange rate and also to the cumulative inflation in a strong currency. So now let's assume that the real equilibrium exchange rate at time 0 is 12 instead of 10. And now we have an estimated yearly inflation of 2% per year during the 10 years for the strong currency. So this cumulative inflation in a strong currency allows us to calculate the strong currency cumulative inflation factor for year 10, which turns out to be 1.22. And then applying the formula, we obtain an equilibrium exchange rate for year 10 of 26.01. If we divide the final weak currency nominal cash flow of year 10 by this equilibrium exchange rate in year 10, we obtain a year 10 free cash flow in a strong currency of 101.58, which is again different from the cash flow that we obtained of 100 exactly before. Summarizing, the new exchange rate for year 10 is 26.01 instead of our previous result of 26.42. 26.01 is now the right exchange rate to convert the last cash flow in weak currency into its equivalent in hard currency regarding the perpetuity. And this is everything we wanted to say today.